Hi. In this video, we're going to be talking about Mary Rowlandson. We're going to be looking at her captivity narrative. Now, remember, this is based on true events. We do know that she was captured. We do know that her town was burnt to the ground. It was one of the around 20% or so of towns that was completely obliterated during King Philip's War. So we do know that that happened. We know that she was kept with the natives for a period of many months until she was able to be ransomed. But keep in mind, this particular narrative that we're going to be looking at was published 6 years after the fact. It was written from memory. She was not able to keep any sort of, diary as she was going. So this is a work of propaganda. Also, it's important to note that this is considered America's first bestseller. It was a huge bestseller both in the States, or what would become the United States, and back in Europe. So this is something that, again, she has a purpose of writing this. She absolutely is trying to do this propagandistic things of setting up, here's how women are supposed to live. She has the political purpose of a call to arms. She also has the Puritan purpose that we're going to be looking at of saying, if I had lived better, if I had been doing things more appropriately as according to how I'm supposed to be living as a Puritan, these things wouldn't have been done to me. This was something that was done as a test of faith and as punishment for not being a good enough Puritan. And she does compare herself to Joseph. So we're going to be looking through this work. It is a long work, so we're not going to be, doing a line by line reading, but we're going to be looking through some of the more important details to help you kind of see what's going on here. So she gives a date. This makes it really nice for historians so they can double check the historical record of the 10th of February, 1675. And we can go, obviously we see that this was adapted a little bit in your gloss, but that's a very handy thing that historians can double check and see, is this something that actually happened? So when you get details like that, it's really nice to be able to double check, is this a pure work of fiction, or is this something that actually does have basis in fact? And she talks about them coming to Lancaster, and Lancaster was under attack, and this was an anticipated attack. So her husband had left. He had gone to seek governmental help at the time. So this is, again, something that's very common in this kind of story, that the wife is left to fend for herself, and they're kind of on the outskirts. So she's really, very much left without defenses. And in this attack, 13 people were killed. At least 24 were taken captive. And she's very graphic in her descriptions. And that might have surprised you to read these very graphic, brutal details. And they talk about how they knock people on the heads to kill them. Some people are shot in the back as they're running away. Some of them have their bowels split open. It's very graphic and gruesome. And it is kind of like that, the Black Legend of the Spaniards. They're spelling out the kind of atrocities to make the natives look as devilish as possible. So yes, these things happened, but were they quite as gruesome? Were they necessarily as awful? Well, maybe not. We have to take her word for it, and she absolutely has a purpose in telling about it this way. And look at the narrative framing that happens here at the bottom of just this very first paragraph. Thus, these murderous wretches went on, burning and destroying before them. So again, she's in control of the narrative. She's in control of how we perceive all of these details. And it's very much like how De las Casas was talking about the Spaniards. And she says, eventually they came to our house, and quickly it was the dolefulest day that ever mine eyes saw. And so they come to her house. We had 6 stout dogs belonging to our garrison, but none of them would stir, she says. Though another time, if any Indian had come to the door, they were ready to fly upon him and tear him down. The Lord hereby would make us the more acknowledge his hand, and to see that our help is always in him. So from the very beginning here of this very first remove, the top of the story, She is using this as Puritan propaganda, as saying, why are you looking at dogs for help? Why did you send to the government for help? You should have been coming to me for help. The reason all this bad stuff's happening to you is because you looked to the wrong place. In other words, put your faith in God. She's using the story from the very beginning of her telling of it as this idea of, pushing this Puritan world belief. Come go along with us. I told them they would kill me. They answered, if I were willing to go along with them, they would not hurt me. And that did happen historically. We know that there were captives taken, generally for ransom money. But this does something interesting to the story. Obviously, we couldn't have the captivity narrative if there were no captives. But it begs the question, why? They were so willing to indiscriminately kill men, women, children. Why her? Why were they willing to say, oh, just come with us and we'll save you? Well, that had to be a question that Mary Rowlandson was asking. And you can see how that would feed into the Puritan kind of mindset of, what did I particularly do? How am I elect? How does God's predestination fit in here? Because remember, they don't believe in anything other than predestination. They think everything is set out for a reason. And it also, you can see, kind of ties in just a little bit to the ideas in the Salem witch trials of, if I repent, if I go through this purgative period, then I can be redeemed, right? So a lot of what's happening in this story is very intertwined with Calvinist beliefs and the Puritan worldview. So keep that in mind. It's everything you read is always going to be informed by the beliefs of the people who wrote it, by the audience that they are writing it for. Nothing ever sits in a vacuum. Whenever you read a piece of literature, it's not written in a vacuum. Okay. So then we get to the first remove. And remember, these removes, they're talking about times when they travel. So they're traveling, and again, it's this awful, really descriptive, graphic thing where she's talking about how their bodies are wounded and bleeding, and so are their hearts. They go a mile, but they're still able to see the town. So that's almost, again, this sort of punishment. They have to see the burning town and all the dead bodies strewn about it that night. And they were asked if, she asked if they could lie in the house instead of outside. And she was mocked for that. And she had to see them roaring and singing and dancing and yelling of the black creatures in the night, which made the place a lively resemblance of hell. So all her language, again, it's using that kind of Puritan symbolism. She feels like she was captured but taken to hell, as opposed to if she'd just been killed, she would be in heaven by now. And as miserable was the waste that they're made of horses, cattle, sheep, swine, calves, lambs, roasting pigs, and fowl, some roasting, some lying and burning, and some boiling to feed our merciless enemies. And remember, guys, these are people who struggle to eat. They're not just lying around with tons of stuff extra. So anything that they see being taken to feed their enemies, or just, laying around as waste, that's food that someone can't be eating. That's food that they struggled really hard for. Times were tough. It wasn't an easy life. So she's not just seeing, waste. She's seeing starvation, and she's seeing a bunch of struggle that's going for nothing laying in the ground here. And she talks about how everything is sad. Her husband is gone, and they're saying they're going to kill her husband when he comes back. So don't worry about that anyway. Her children are gone. Her relations and friends gone. House and home and all her comforts gone. And for all she knows, she's going to be dead the next moment. So she's about as bereft as can be here. And she talks about how people were killed even on the Sabbath day. Just, again, these are just monsters, is that the idea she's trying to create here in this first remove. The second remove, this idea is how terrible. Again, she's creating this terrible, hellish landscape. So they're traveling She talks about how not my tongue or pen can express the sorrows of my heart. But God was with me, carrying me along so she didn't fail. Her baby is wounded. Of course, that's just a terrible story. But she moves on. She survives. The third remove, she's able to write a little bit. But it was a wearisome and tedious day, what with my own wound and my child's being so exceeding sick in an lamentable condition. And so they get to an Indian town. When we were come, oh, the number of pagans, now merciless enemies. And again, that's quite a different way of describing them when we're used to hearing stories like Pocahontas and Squanto, the first Thanksgiving. But remember, that period of cooperation was very short-lived. It went straight into this warfare period pretty immediately, and has pretty much been in that period from then on. Oh, the number of pagans, now merciless enemies, that there came about me, that I may say as David, I had fainted unless I had believed. You're noticing, I hope, that she starts sprinkling in these Bible, verses pretty quickly, and she's doing it throughout. It's almost like she's giving a sermon, and remember, that's on purpose. This is literature. This isn't a diary. Mary Rowlandson's going to assume that her reader will immediately reference these verses and know what they are. If you don't, which, makes sense if you didn't grow up in the Christian church, well, you're going to need to look them up. And you're going to want their context. You're going to want to know what story she's referencing. Don't just pull a verse out of context just by looking at the gloss. A lot of times there is contextual information that is important as well. BibleGateway.com is really good for that because it'll give you the verse in modern English. It'll also give it to you in a lot of different biblical versions. So you can look at, for example, the Calvinist Church. The Geneva Bible is the Calvinist Bible, and it is listed on BibleGateway.com, so you can see what their version looks like. It'll also give you contextual version and interpretations. So it's a really, really good resource, and I encourage you to use it. So anyway, back to the text. So the next day was the Sabbath, she says. And she's remembering the story of the Psalm of David's where I had fainted unless I had believed. And so she's remembering, okay, the next day is the Sabbath. I then remembered how careless I had been of God's holy time. How many Sabbaths I had lost and misspent, and how evilly I had walked in God's sight, which lay so close unto my spirit, that it was easy for me to see how righteous it was with God to cut off the thread of my life and cast me out of his presence forever. So she's saying that she had not been a good Puritan, that she had not spent the entire Sabbath in contemplation, that she had wasted it. And so it would be perfect justice for God to allow these demonic heathens to kill her in this awful way. But God was so merciful that he's giving her this other chance, that he sent these natives to her as a punishment to show her how to get her life back on the path. And this is actually a merciful act. So this is something that these captivity narratives do. They're telling us this story, but they're making them into a morality tale. And in so doing, not only are they upholding the Puritan perspective, but they are also completely othering the natives. They are, in essence, dehumanizing them to the point that they're just monsters in a book. They're ogres, in other words, that if you look, has a ripple effect throughout culture, even unto today. There are a lot of people today who don't really think of natives as being around still. They don't realize that there are living, breathing Native Americans today. They still have this image in their head of, the evil savage that's riding around on horses coming into town to destroy the town and kill everybody. And that image has its beginnings in Mary Rowlandson's narrative. And stuff like Last of the Mohicans was absolutely influenced by this particular tale. So she is trying to push a Puritan perspective, but it actually has really long-reaching consequences in our American culture and the way that we have relationships with our indigenous population. So pay attention to that. Pay attention to what she's doing. And she, I'm sure, didn't really know what the long-reaching consequences were going to be, but I don't think she would have cared either. Because again, they don't think of themselves as being people in the same way. These are the natives are people that they're enslaving, when they capture natives, they don't just think of them as enemies. They think of them as not really human. They capture them and they sell them into slavery in the West Indies. Remember John Winthrop had native slaves. So we're starting to see a lot of the seeds of some of the tensions that are ongoing in our culture and country today in this literature right here. Thus 9 days I sat upon my knees with my babe in my lap till my flesh was raw again. My child being even ready to depart this sorrowful world, they bade me carry it out to another wigwam, I suppose because they would not be troubled with such spectacles. Whither I went with a very heavy heart, and down I sat with the picture of death in my lap. About 2 hours in the night, my sweet babe like a lamb departed this life, it being about 6 years and 5 months old. So, a little bit older than you might have imagined it, as she kept calling it a baby, but she spends a lot of time talking about this kind of injustice and has really built up this image of this mother whose innocent baby has been taken from her. And that's very much on purpose. Again, that's a propagandistic thing, because there are very few images that are kind of designed to rile us up more than a mother and her baby being taken from her. And she says that even that she couldn't even stand to be thinking about dead people before, but now she couldn't leave her baby's side. I have thought since of the wonderful goodness of God to me in preserving me in the use of my reason and senses in that distressed time, that I did not use wicked and violent means to end my own miserable life. So again, she doesn't fall back into misery or despair or anger. She does the very Puritan thing. It's very Anne Bradstreet of praising God. Yeah, my house is burned down, but yes, my baby has been taken from me, but at least God bore me up so that I could be with it and not kill myself. And she talks about how she was sold to an Indian, so she's talking about her own enslavement, whether that's enslavement in the British sense, we're not entirely sure. We don't really have records. So she's interpreting it as slavery. Again, kind of like Devaka interpreted what was happening to him as enslavement. But that could just be a concept of her interpretation of events through her own framework. We have to take her word for it because we don't have any other context to do so. She compares herself to Jacob, and that's kind of interesting because usually in these captivity narratives, they're comparing themselves to Joseph, who is the one who's enslaved, but she's comparing herself to Jacob, who is Joseph's father. So again, that's another Bible reference that you might need to look up if you're not familiar with the story. She brings up again some very nasty savagery. The hideous insulting and triumphing that there was over some Englishmen scalps that they had taken, as their manner is, and brought with them. I cannot but take notice of the wonderful mercy of God to me in those afflictions, in sending me a Bible. And we get a lot of these kind of conflicting descriptions. So you'll have descriptions throughout here where the natives are actually kind of nice to her for being captors. They give her Bibles, they let her study, they give her extra food if she'll, sew up their clothes and knit them some things. But they're all horrible savages. It just reminds us again of the kind of unreliability of the narrator, of the fact that we are seeing one person's perspective of events that happen to them from their own point of view. This isn't a historical textbook kind of thing. This isn't somebody looking back after the fact with unbiased eyes. So just keep that in mind when you see these inconsistencies. That's because this is a first person point of view. It's written 6 years later. And she's not a terribly reliable narrator. That's not to say she's lying. That's not to say she's making things up. But that is to say she's interpreting events that happen to her through the lens of her own perspective. So just keep that in mind as you read. And she says, she took the Bible and it came to her to read the 28th chapter of Deuteronomy. And you have a gloss in your textbook that tells you it's a chapter concerned with blessings for obedience. So God sends her a Bible and reminds her to be obedient. That's what she gets out of this. And again, it's that Puritan viewpoint of, okay, here's my lesson. I need to be obedient. And you can see why Puritans would really like this and why this would become a bestseller. It's almost like an instructional religious text for her. Fourth remove, she's seen her daughter Mary for a little while, but now they get separated. And again, that's one of those nice things that you wouldn't expect evil, savage, devilish captors who are just bent on torturing her to do. But you kind of get the idea from her that, okay, I'm learning my lesson. God's teaching me, so I get these kind of niceties along the way. So go on over to the fifth remove. And here she's giving us some of the discussed aspects of these captivity narratives. Remember we talked about how they show, well, women are supposed to be a certain way, and I have to go through all these things that are not the way women are supposed to be. And this is some of these examples. On Saturday, they boiled an old horse's leg, which they had got, and so we drank of the broth. In the first week of my being among them, I hardly ate anything, because she's still, a nice Puritan lady, and she has those Puritan sensibilities. The second week, I found my stomach grow very faint for want of something, and yet it was very hard to get down their filthy trash. But the third week, though I could think how formerly my stomach would turn against this or that, and I could starve and die before I could eat such things, yet they were sweet and savory to my taste. And then she goes on a little bit further down, about halfway down this paragraph. And here I cannot but take notice of the strange providence of God in preserving the heathen. And there were babies, and some were sick, and all this stuff. And she talks about, and yet they're taken care of. Something that Mary Rowlandson never seems to put together in this piece is all the stuff that she's disgusted by. The ground nuts that she talks about, the acorns, that's just their normal food. Having to eat, bear meat, or the boiled horse's leg or various things like that. That's what they eat. These long distances that she had to travel with them, they're all traveling that long distance too. And that's just normal. Again, that's part of that othering, that dehumanization. If it's so difficult for her as a civilized Puritan person, but it's not difficult for the native, what does that mean? So there's this kind of cognitive dissonance that Mary Rowlandson, as a Puritan, has to deal with. She has a lot of trouble with this. It's not correct. It's not right. But they're okay with it and they thrive. So what does that mean? Does that mean that God has given them some special providence to help them? That's the conclusion she comes to. So she's interpreting them as instruments of God who don't really exist on their own. They don't really have any agency. They're only there to be used as lessons for the Puritans or as punishment for the Puritans, so they can thrive in all of these situations in which the Puritans wouldn't be able to. The less generous interpretation of this, which some other authors take, is that, again, they're devils, so they don't need all the things that humans need. But it's important to take notice of that kind of dehumanizing language. Seventh remove, she has some kind of more of this where she talks about how she's really kind of going native is the term that you might hear sometimes. And she got herself 2 ears of Indian corn and somebody stole one from her, and she's trying to eat horse liver and they're stealing that away from her. And she has this line, for to the hungry soul, every bitter thing is sweet. And again, that's another proverb that's from the Bible. So she's really constructing the story around the narrative that she wants to tell. That's not to say these things didn't happen, but she's picking and choosing the details over these 11 weeks that she was with them to tell the story that she wants to tell. Let's see. She even tells us the story about how this was used for her to stop smoking. Then I went to see King Philip. So she actually meets Metacom. He bade me come in and sit down and asked me whether I would smoke it. A usual compliment nowadays among saints and sinners, but this no way suited me. For though I had formerly used tobacco, yet I had left it ever since I was first taken. It seems to be a bait the devil lays to make men lose their precious time. I remember with shame how formerly, when I had taken 2 or 3 pipes, I was presently ready for another, such a bewitching thing it is. But I thank God he has now given me power over it. Surely there are many who may be better employed than to lie sucking a stinking tobacco pipe. It's astonishing the things that she brings out of this story. She's even saying, God even used my captivity as a way to break me of this idle habit of smoking that was stealing my time. And guys, that may sound very silly to you, but tobacco today has a lot of additives and it's processed in a way that it was not. It was a whole lot stronger. It was practically a hallucinogen the way that they smoked it. So it was a lot more akin to marijuana at the time. So she's even saying, God even had me kidnapped to break me of my drug habit, and now he's having the king devil, Metacom himself, King Philip himself, try to tempt me with this evil drug. I mean, that's astonishing that she's using this story of her captivity to push this kind of Puritan narrative and this Puritan worldview. It's something. And by then she's starting to get some privileges. She offered money to her master, but he bade me keep it. So yeah, you're starting to question, is this really the worst of captivities? But again, she's not presenting it as such. She's presenting it as a trial from God that she has to go through in order to have this kind of spiritual regeneration so that she can be purified. And she even says, I cannot but admire at the wonderful power and goodness of God to me, in that, though I was gone from home and met with all sorts of Indians and those I had no knowledge of, and there being no Christian soul near me, yet not one of them offered the least imaginable miscarriage to me. I mean, you know, her baby's dead, but this really is not what that's about, right? This is not a historical account of the things that happened to her. This is a spiritual account about her redeeming herself from this backslide. Let's see. And we just have some more of the same, really. Now I had time to examine all my ways. My conscience did not accuse me of unrighteousness toward one or other, yet I saw how in my walk with God I had been a careless creature. I remembered how on the night before and after the Sabbath, when my family was about me and relations and neighbors with us, we could pray and sing and then refresh our bodies with the good creatures of God, and then have a good comfortable bed to lie down on. But instead of all this, I had only a little swill for the body, and then like a swine must lay down upon the ground. I mean, this is what she's telling this story for. This is a morality story to remind people you gotta be a good Puritan. And it's interesting because, you know, her husband died when she was eventually, you know, not caught, but she was eventually returned. Sometime after her husband died, and then she remarried. And in her later life, she really didn't care that much about this story. She wasn't that interested in it. But it was a bestseller. People really responded to this story. And as kind of an interesting historical side note, her ransom, because she was eventually ransomed for 20 pounds, that's a huge amount for a Puritan. And so they actually ended up having to raise this money through public subscription in Boston. And I thought you guys just might want to know that piece of trivia that she essentially was crowdsourced. Her ransom money was basically raised through a GoFundMe campaign, and I thought you might find that pretty neat. But you can see how this story, I don't think we need to break down every single detail for you to get the idea, was being used in all these different kind of propagandistic ways. She took something that happened to her and made it fit within her cultural framework. That's something humans have always done. Perhaps in classes in the future, they'll have entire units on lockdown stories and what their political purpose was. But always keep in mind that a narrative has a purpose, it has a reason, and you can see what Mary Rowlandson's narrative was serving.